So welcome everybody. We're presenting today live from the St. Paul campus. We have people joining us online from satellite locations throughout the state and online. So hopefully everybody can see and hear everything all right. One thing you might notice is that if you've joined us, you might have been forced into a full screen mode once we started the presentation. And if you want to change that, just hit the green button at the top, and that will bring you into a menu where you can choose to go to the chat box and camera and see everything that's going on and ask questions. Backing up, my name is Emily Donbeck. I'm the program coordinator for Minnesota U of M Extension Forestry. This is the last of the 2015 webinar series that we offer in conjunction with SFEC. Next year's schedule is going to be released soon. It's getting finalized, and it'll be posted on both of our websites at myminnesotawoods.umn.edu as well as the SFEC website. Let's see here. We have two speakers today. Matt Russell, he's an assistant professor with the U of M Department of Forest Resources and also an extension forestry specialist. And then Chris Woodall is a research forester with the U.S. Forest Service, and he's based here in St. Paul at the Northern Research Station. Today they're going to be presenting on impacts of deer browse on forest regeneration across the northern U.S. And we'll pause throughout the presentation to ask questions, but as always, you're welcome to submit questions via the chat feature on WebEx, and I will relay those questions to the speakers. So without further ado, Chris, you can start? Thanks.
All right, thanks for the introduction. I am excited about this topic and this talk really for two reasons. I think if you walk through any forest in Minnesota, you're going to see the impacts of browse. If you give any length of time in forest, you're going to see that. The other thing, as far as a scientist, that makes this topic exciting is that we really don't have that much information on it across the state, definitely, and across the nation. So there's a lot of research unknowns, and so a lot of what you'll see today is ongoing work, trying to pull together data sets that we have available to us, but also efforts to design future research and more data collection. So as a kind of roadmap to the topics we're going to touch on, a little bit of background on tree regeneration in the context of forest management, some details about our inventory data that we've used to start to address this issue from the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. Matt will go over some of the insights into study results that are preliminary, and then I'll talk about some new emerging data that we have that we're currently collecting and what we can do with it in the future. So why is tree regeneration important? So certainly we know that it's the future forest. It certainly will guide management in the future. We've looked at tree regeneration data at large scales more recently. We haven't had this type of data in the past, so we've been able to look at comparisons between where current trees exist versus their respective seedlings, and start to find some interesting results. Like for northern pin oak, looking at where the mean latitude of tree observations versus the seedlings, you see sort of a shift northward. Certainly regeneration dynamics are complex. We'll get into those a little bit, but we can start to monitor where currently these ranges reside and where they may be in the future. So assessing tree regeneration is fundamental to sustainable assessments, and also an indicator of environmental stresses we may see in the future. So longer droughts, more episodic rainfall events may result in stressed regeneration and abundance in the future. So some findings to date. No need to go into a lot of details of these various studies, but like I mentioned previously, we are starting to examine the relationship between what we call the adult trees and seedlings across the landscape. It is more dynamic than we previously thought, which has emerged in recent research. We've looked at it as far as in terms of ranges across the U.S. tree ranges, and seeing that potentially ranges may be contracting for certain tree species We see tree seedling abundance perhaps decreasing across eastern forests. Largely, eastern forests are maturing overall across the eastern U.S., so one would hypothesize then that tree regeneration in the understory might be decreasing also. So as far as successful regeneration, I put up here the classic natural reproduction triangle, and three major sides of that triangle are the seed bed, and so in terms of shade, the soil substrate, but also included in this is browse pressure. So we're seeing that as far as anecdotally influencing tree regeneration. There's also seed supply. So certainly the stand dynamics of the overstory, stand density, species composition, the mass periodicity, etc. go into that, and the environment. And that's where concerns about climate change can arise from concerns about droughts and precipitation, snowpack, lack thereof, or deep snowpack, etc. So as far as scientists, the researchers in these fields, these various variables of the triangle are the ones we try to look at and see if we can quantitatively measure, so we can assess regeneration. I touched on some of these as far as drivers of forest regeneration. A lot of them have typically been taught in forestry schools and practiced certainly, such as managing your stand density and your stand structure, your species composition, how you disturb the understory during stand treatments certainly drive forest regeneration. But other things are being examined, such as the mulching effect, deer protection afforded by down dead wood, and nurse log effect, and certainly invasive species in the understory can affect tree regeneration. So those are some emerging topics that we're examining in the context of all those drivers of regeneration. And here's a picture of our friends, the deer, and why we're here today to discuss this in a little bit more detail. And their browse pressure certainly causes us to have to protect our investment in regeneration, certainly when we're doing manual planting and protecting the terminal buds, such as this capping effort. And when we don't do that, certainly the browse, the deer munching on the buds can certainly set back our regeneration, and that, as far as forest management, is lost money on the landscape. So as far as our data source, we're starting to examine some of these topics. I'll briefly touch on our national inventory that we have across all land ownerships of the U.S. It has been running as an annual program for over 10 years now. Out of the U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service. It is a 3-phase inventory, which I'll touch on. It really stemmed from a farm bill in the late 90s passed by Congress that all our stakeholders, state foresters, industry, all came together and realized that we really need a consistent, systematic, and unbiased inventory of forest resources across the U.S., as opposed to the past model of periodic inventories by state that varied in their techniques and design. As I mentioned, various phases. First phase, we identify forest versus non-forest across the landscape. This is used in post-stratification to increase the precision of our population estimates. But more importantly, we have these interpenetrating panels, hexagonal panels across the landscape where we allocate plots. So one of those panels is approximately 6,000 acres. We have one permanently measured plot in each of those hexagons. So one plot for every 6,000 acres. In the eastern U.S., currently we're trying to sample about 20% a year. So we have this kind of moving average of remeasurements coming in to estimate change over time. The western U.S. is on a 10% per year cycle because of costs associated with the wilderness areas and slower growth in the western U.S. The phase 3, so we have a subset of those plots. There are one per every 6,000 acres that we measure additional attributes on. The first phase, we just do standing live and standing dead trees. Phase 3, we measure additional attributes such as down dead wood, invasive species, etc. Sometimes our sample intensity can increase for phase 3 if states come up with additional funding, etc. So in our inventory, I mentioned we measure standing live and standing dead trees. Well, we also measure seedlings on a small microplot. And so the definition within that part of the inventory is a diameter root collar less than 2.5 centimeters and a requirement of minimum heights for conifers and hardwoods. So some would call this almost an advanced tree seedling survey. Certainly our field crew aren't counting 1 centimeter high spruce regeneration out there. So it is more of an advanced tree seedling regeneration survey in the hopes of efficiencies across our plot network. I mentioned the other attributes measured on our phase 3 inventory, and those include things such as the shrubs, vines, herbs. Certainly those can afford insight into regeneration dynamics of trees, especially when you're measuring the cover by height layers. You get an idea of the stocking of the understory of a plot. Certainly other things that are relevant to tree regeneration are downwoody materials and that substrate we talked about for regeneration, soils and the biomass of duck and litter on the forest floor. There's another emerging data set we'll show some initial results on later on that is exciting and is very much focused on deer, and that is started in 2012 in the northern states. We added an additional component of measuring the level of deer browse by height of seedlings, tree seedlings. So we'll get into that later on, but that is also an emerging data set as far as an opportunity to refine our understanding of deer browse. So insights into deer and regeneration dynamics will be taken over by Matt, so he'll give some of those results.
Thanks, Chris. We just tag teamed in, so I'm now the live player. But I want to talk more about a lot of the data sets that Chris mentioned and how we're using them to really assess regeneration dynamics in the face of deer, which is this big problem that many managers are faced with today. Before we get into sort of some results, so one of the questions we often have is, how much deer is too much? So, our states go out and generally have some indicators. We have deer density maps for a given county, for a given wildlife management unit that really showcase, through population measurements of deer, how many deer are on the landscape. And so really what we can look to the literature and find out sort of what values are presented as maybe too much deer. We might start thinking about this many deer might be influencing what we do on the ground in terms of management. And so a really great study from northern Wisconsin by Alverson and others, and they sort of mentioned that sort of this 8 deer per square kilometer, or roughly if you multiply that by about 2.5 to 3, it's about 21 deer per square mile. Well, that's a standard level where you can begin to do some management, and maybe deer browse might start to become an impact at higher deer densities, more than 8 deer per square kilometer. However, what they really showcase is that if you're really dealing with browse-sensitive tree species, things like northern white cedar, which we're concerned with in Minnesota, it's really much lower than that, where you need to be thinking about different management approaches in the face of these deer densities. So generally, if it's about 1 to 4 deer per square kilometer, you're generally pretty okay to try to meet your management objectives, given the amount of deer that are out there in the forest. And so just sort of some general rules of thumb that are similar to the forest types we're dealing with in Minnesota, that are sort of benchmarks for assessing deer density levels. And so what a lot of people have done, when we want to understand what the impacts of deer are on the vegetation dynamics and on the browse resistance of certain species, well, many of you have probably seen something like this. That is sort of the traditional exposure study that folks will put up. And so as an example, the Nature Conservancy and Mark White's research up in Lake County, Minnesota, is a really great example of this. And what they're showing is basically monitoring long-term vegetation dynamics within the fence where deer are not allowed, and outside the fence where deer are allowed to browse freely. And their results are pretty stark when you look at things like stem density for given size classes of different trees that are of interest to them. Generally, lower numbers of seedlings per hectare in those unfenced areas compared to those fenced areas. And this is really looking at a long-term story of forest regeneration. But the general theme of the story is that deer drive forest structure. And so using these fenced exposures, we're able to tell something about the vegetation dynamics. Really at regional scales, at ownership levels, one of the problems with exposures is they cost money to implement, and they're really time-consuming to maintain after you put them up when you deal with things like trees blowing down on the fence line and other things. And so how many deer does Minnesota have? Well, on an annual basis, the DNR in their wildlife division creates a deer density map based on their strategies for monitoring the populations of deer across the state. And so generally, sort of the deer hunters probably know where the deer are. So if you're a deer hunter, maybe this map looks familiar to you. Maybe you choose wisely where you choose to go hunting. But we can really relate that to things like a common metric is the winter severity index. So the idea being if it's a bad winter the year before, well, the next year you might see some numbers in the deer density populations that reflect that bad winter. So DNR really makes these really great, useful maps to look at sort of the ecological drivers that might influence deer densities, and then comes up with a map on an annual basis to really let us know how many deer are out there by wildlife management. What some folks have done, there really isn't a national deer density map, and Chris and some others in the Forest Service really tried to look to see if we can find something, and this is about what we found. So there's this group, Quality Deer Management Association. What they do is they take all those state reports of deer densities by wildlife management units, and they compile this map on an annual basis. So they're basically compiling all these different reports from individual states to make this national map. And what we've done, folks in the Forest Service, have basically taken this density map of deer and overlaid it to the FIA data sets that Chris was talking about. So now we know sort of if we have an indicator of how many deer are in a certain area, and we have the forest inventory information, things like the overstory tree attributes, the number of seedlings, well, we might know something about the influence of deer on vegetation attributes. And so a lot of this is subjective. A lot of the problems we dealt with in terms of using this national map were that different states use different boundaries for their wildlife management units, and so the scale of those aren't necessarily consistent across individual states. And so it is a bit of a subjective map, but at least it's a start. It's a way to try to link deer density with the vegetation that we're concerned with. So I want to go back to the question of how much deer is too much to have successful regeneration. So if you go back to the two different levels that was proposed in that northern Wisconsin study, basically a standard level where you might be able to be meeting your management objectives, or really where you want to be if you have browse-sensitive tree species, that is 8 deer per square kilometer versus 1 to 4 deer per square kilometer. How many plots across the U.S. and within Minnesota and Wisconsin are meeting those targets? Well, what our data are showing is that for the northern U.S., about 56% of the plots are less than 8 deer per square kilometer. So you can think of about half the plots across the northern U.S., that is from Minnesota to Maine, from Maryland to Missouri, are below that deer density threshold. If you look at for browse-sensitive species, it's almost about a third, or 28%. We're doing a little bit better in Minnesota. 72% of our plots meet that less than 8 deer per square kilometer threshold. Almost 40% of our plots at 1 to 4 deer per square kilometer. Minnesota is certainly in a lot better shape than Wisconsin is. So Wisconsin has only about 10% of plots underneath that 8 deer per square kilometer threshold, and there's less than 1%, it's really one FIA plot that has less than 4 deer per square kilometer in Wisconsin. So how much deer do we have? This is sort of a reflection of how many FIA plots are meeting and are found within those thresholds that we might think of as good indicators for management that we might be doing on the ground. Chris mentioned tree seedlings. We have tree seedling information from all of those FIA plots reflected on a smaller size plot. This is basically the seedling abundance across the northern U.S. And across that range that we're interested in. So purple colors, blue colors indicate higher seedling abundance. Red and orange colors, lower seedling abundance. So not surprisingly, a lot of the areas that we're focused on, sort of the northern systems, in Maine, Minnesota, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, tend to see higher seedlings compared to some other areas across the northern U.S. Chris also mentioned we have some information about invasive plants using the FIA data. What the figure on the left shows is the number of invasive plants at each of those phase 3 FIA plots across the state. So what's the general trend here? Well, the southeastern part of the state dealing with quite a few invasive plants. Generally, the boundary waters as you get up into the Superior National Forest, a lot of black indicating, well, we didn't find any invasive plants when we sampled up there in that region. And the graph or the table on the right is an indication of, if you look at the FIA survey units, we've got 4 survey units, aspen birch, northern pine, central hardwood, and the prairie region. This is an indicator of how many of the total sampled plots did we find an invasive plant on. And so in general, pretty high in the 70 to 80% for northern pine, central hardwood, and the prairies, but a little bit lower, about a third of all plots in the aspen birch. So generally in Minnesota anyway, about half of our plots that we observe have at least one invasive plant. So we can begin to use things like the seedling abundance and the invasive plant information to tell us something about what might be the impacts of deer on those individual forest attributes. Our research questions really then are, what are the impacts of deer density on structure and composition of forest understories across this region that we're interested in, that is the northern U.S. And then what are the trends in tree seedling abundance and introduced plant species or invasive species if we know something like deer density? Is there a relationship between deer and the presence and abundance of invasive plants?
We have a quick online question asking if you can go over again what tree species are classified as browse sensitive.
Yeah, it's managers certainly understand. Northern white cedar comes to mind as one that's very browse sensitive. Red pine is another one. We spent, some managers have spent probably a lot of time this fall bud capping red pine to sort of keep it safe from any deer browse. As we're going to more hardwood dominated stands, we're very interested in sugar maple in terms of its browse sensitivity. And a lot of that varies by region. So in red pine in the Northeast, I'm not sure that they would really consider that a browse sensitive species. But we certainly do here in the upper Midwest. So it's really depending on what state you're in, really what's out there in terms of what browse sensitive species deer might be going after. I'll show some insight now about looking at tree seedling abundance, which is graphed on the y-axis, against the amount of deer per square kilometer. So we've got 4 categories of deer per square kilometer, about less than 6, 6 to 12, 12 to 18, and then everything above 18. And the general trend is, when we look at the sort of broad forest type groups that the FIA designates at each plot, the general trend is really a decrease in seedling abundance as the deer density increases across the landscape. And so generally see the averages are certainly declining as you get more deer per square kilometer. And the bars indicate the range in variability for a given forest type group. But clearly, it seems to be that deer density might be a factor in explaining how many seedlings we have out there. So in trying to take a look at what might be the real driving factors of tree seedlings, if we have all this information from FIA and we have deer density estimates, what might be the real drivers? And so to do that, we really looked at sensitivity analyses. So these are really things, if you have a number of factors and want to find out which one is most sensitive to your output, in our case, tree seedlings, which one of them sort of comes out on top. And so we added several variables here. From what we found was that forest type group, stand age, and deer density were really the top three drivers of tree seedling abundance across the northern U.S. And some other variables, relative density, above ground biomass, site index came out as lower ranking variables compared to some of the other ones, forest type group being the most common, the more highly influential variable in this analysis. Now we wanted to take a look at, well, we have basically a list of all the invasive plants that we're finding at each FIA plot. And so can we use deer density to tell us something about the number of invasive species that are on an FIA plot? And so the graph on the y-axis shows is basically the number of introduced or invasive species. I use the terms interchangeably, but essentially they're the same thing. And then we have, again, that same deer density estimate on the x-axis. And so what are we seeing here? Well, generally, if you look at the trends for the various forest type groups, there seems to be a higher number of introduced species as you go from low deer density to high deer density. So really interesting to take a look at if you want to understand the impacts of deer, not just influencing browse and seedling regeneration, but looking sort of more holistically at different forest health attributes in the stand. And so in this case, deer having sort of an indirect effect on the number of introduced species that we're finding. And so the reason that this is with the phase 3 information, so we have a little over 200 plots in Minnesota, and sort of very similar in other states, but the reason we just don't have we don't have data for some of these high deer densities is just because they're not common. There's just a few plots, and we really wanted to show the data that we have information for when looking at introduced plants and this deer density relationship. So again, we're very interested in looking at the sensitivity of all the different variables we have that we could grab from something like FIA that tells us something about both the understory species richness, how many species are we finding in each FIA plot. That's off to the left. And then the number of introduced species that we're finding in the understory, and that's off to the right. We're very interested, we categorize in the phase 3 information the cover as sort of measured by percents and all the different species in different height layers. And so when we're looking at deer browse, it's really that 0 to 6 feet height layer that we're most interested in, assuming that, well, baby deer might not be browsing anything above that. And so this is really specifically honing in on that height layer specifically. What we're finding for species richness, again, forest type group and duck biomass, really sort of one of those sort of attributes are really coming out on top. But deer density is sort of ranked a little bit lower when it looks at least understory species richness across the northern FIA region. Looking at the number of introduced species, deer density again sort of lands sort of in the middle part of the graph here. But again, things like site index, duck biomass, relative density, sort of some common measures we think about using when we're doing management, really rank as more highly influential variables when it comes to trying to find out what relationship are between the introduced species and all these variables that we're looking at. So I'm going to turn it back over to Chris, and he's going to talk more specifically about this new information we have that's coming online that's really serving as a regeneration indicator for the FIA program.
Before we switch, do you want to do a couple of questions, or do you want to wait to the end?
Sure. Yeah, questions for me or Chris?
The first one from online is for the QDMA map that you showed. Did you contact them directly to obtain the shapefile? And can other people use that?
That's a very good question. Yes, I contacted them directly for the image. They did not have the shapefile, so we digitized that into a shapefile, and so I think we're free to share it. I don't. We haven't published that research yet, but if you, or our emails are at the end of the presentation, so you can contact us for that shapefile.
Okay. And then the other question we have is, what methods do you use to determine deer density? Is it survey by air or droppings or some other method?
Yeah, I don't think I'm really fit to answer that. Yeah, that's a question for the DNR wildlife people, I think. Yeah, I'm sure they use a number of different methods to try to come up with those deer densities. That vary by region, and it's a more easy place to get to. It might vary compared to way up in the northern part of the states. And they actually limit, they don't survey certain areas of the states because for various reasons, low deer densities are hard to get to.
Any other questions?
That's it from online.
Good. Well, I'd like to follow on to that question. That's a very good one to this next part of the presentation, because the problem with that Quality Deer Management Association information is that I think just by looking at it, it highlights how it's kind of subjective around the country, the varying methods for determining deer density, whether it is looking at deer droppings versus like where hunters are gathering, taking the kill. So for that very reason, I think at large scales, this question of deer browse and forest dynamics and regeneration have not been thoroughly investigated. So recognizing that's an issue, our partners, and this really started out with the state of Pennsylvania because they have major deer issues there, unlike, just like many other states, but they approached our program many years ago about collecting additional information on our plots about deer browse. So we really codified that starting around 2012 with this new, additional approach to measuring our plots for deer browse information. And this work is really stems from Will McWilliams, who is the third author on this talk, and I'll be presenting some of his very emerging research, I think, as of the past week or two. So very new and as of yet unpublished, because this data is still coming in. So we have what we call a regeneration indicator, or advanced tree seedling regeneration indicator. And those blue states there are where it's being collected. And basically the microplot where we have traditionally measured our tree seedling abundance, are now measuring impact and by height class of the tree regeneration. So we have these heights from 2 to 6 inches, 6 inches to 1 foot, 1 to 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 10, which, as Matt indicated, can be useful to look at browse, height through the canopy, but also an impact code, very low to very high. Once again, that's fairly subjective, but that is not the only technique we have, is looking at across the sampling season of these foresters doing the survey work. They start to have an idea of very low versus high browse on the tree species. So this just started in 2012, and will take a number of years to get the full sample in, but we have a number of field seasons of data now that we're compiling. So as we indicated in this slide, we only have about 30% of the complete sample in, but we're able to make some initial estimates. So looking at browse impact in Minnesota, the results show us that almost half, closing up on 50% of the tree seedlings we examined had medium or high browse impact. And combining that with low, you would say almost all tree seedlings have some impact of browse. Really very low is not really that existent. So as far as looking at regeneration across the plot network in Minnesota, there's always evidence of browse impact. Sometimes medium, or a good portion of the time, medium or very high. And as far as counts, so we're out also look at our abundance by height class, which we have not had before. Certainly the taller seedlings are higher abundance. You'll see some species distribution information on that in a subsequent slide. Looking at species composition, number of seedlings per acre, sugar maple and black ash lead the way as far as the greatest abundance across the state derived from this new information. So in the past, as a comparison, before we had this information, we only had really an idea of height by, well, you have the size information across saplings and adults, looking at the species. So it used to be where you'd say, well, it's really aspens dominating the smaller trees in the understory. With this new information, we can now kind of remove that blinder and see what's really going down to really small regeneration, really short across our forest. So that's where we see the abundance of maples and the ashes are really taking root, pardon the pun. So we look forward to more information, refined information, as we get the rest of this sample up to 100% over the years ahead, and really examine in detail the browse impact by size and species across the region. Starting to look into research as far as mapping this herbivory impact across the region. Remember that that deer density study map, as far as being fairly crude. Well, we are hoping this is going to be a refined approach to looking at that. So this is a probability model, results of exceeding medium deer impact across the region. And obviously red is a higher probability exceeding medium impact. So you can see forested areas of the lake states as far as their probability of medium impact. And this kind of aligns with what you've seen as far as some of the Minnesota DNR results. So it's good to see at this initial stage some alignment. But what we can hope to derive in the future is more relationship with forest attributes in this context. Also able to predict the probability of exceeding low deer impact, and that's where Pennsylvania and Wisconsin lead the way as far as impact across the breadth of their forests. And we know that from really Wisconsin DNR and Pennsylvania being so concerned and involved in our program to inventory the browse impact. So in addition to the data sets we've offered up, there are other ones of interest and that we have examined in the context of tree forest dynamics and the deer density, and that's the Lyme disease occurrences. Certainly blood-borne diseases derived from the life cycle associated with deer, and also the one that certainly families and people that drive across our roadways and the insurance industry really care about is that the motor vehicle crash reports. So certainly those statistics are an indicator, once more, additional data source of deer and their impact, but certainly can be subjective due to driving conditions and road network density, but certainly show the personal safety, life, and economic impact of deer. So, in summary, I can handle this, I guess. So, certainly, I think seeing some of the results from that and some of the results coming out of the emerging tree seedling data that we have, deer density played a role in the understory vegetation dynamics. Certainly, looking at sensitivity analysis, you saw it maybe being more important than the relative density of the stand stocking of forests. So it's something that foresters would need to be cognizant of. We've seen that introduced or invasive species can occur at a higher density in higher deer impacted areas. But what we're also seeing is that the research is still emerging. We're trying to collect more data, additional data, and bring modern analyses to bear on those data sets to provide a more direct link between deer, browse, pressure, and the regeneration dynamics, which is we would hope would certainly benefit the future of forest management. So, Matt, do you have anything additional? You're good on the conclusion. So, I think we have here at the end, acknowledgments, and we can get some of the data. Brian Walters helped out a lot with the digitizing of the deer density map we showed earlier. Our FIA data is freely available at that website. For more about the Quality Deer Management Association, there's a link there. I can just Google that. And Minnesota DNR has those deer maps that we provided in the presentation, which I'm sure are updated annually as new information comes in. So we thank you, and then like I said, you can take more questions offline at our email addresses or contact us for those links or data at your will. So thank you. We have a question from the audience. Sure.
Yeah, there's been some good data collected out in Yellowstone National Park, looking at the regeneration down in along water courses, valley bottoms associated, regeneration of populus and salix. And they've associated that with presence of wolves working on the elk herds and keeping the elk herd mobile so they don't focus on an area and eat it down to another. And so they keep the elk moving and they get much more successful regeneration. Now, in your work, and part of this is up in wolf country here, and is there any way to, you're working with deer numbers which are nebulous at best, and you're working with wolf populations which are nebulous, but they kind of know somewhat where wolf packs are located, their areas of movement, and that. Is there any kind of regeneration difference between where wolves are present, actively present, versus not present? See, when you look down at the heavy browsing down and closer down into the ag zone, you have fewer wolves, of course. Yeah. So is there anything associated that way with wolf presence? Yeah, we hadn't thought to take a look at wolves, but at least from a research side, if there's a correlation between wolf density and deer density, well, that might tell us something about the vegetation too. So at least keeps them moving. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and that's certainly, one of the predators of deer could be, they know where the deer are, obviously, or else it wouldn't be in the certain areas that they're in. We haven't thought to take a look at that. I think really because we're focused on the northern U.S. and, there's a good proportion of the northern U.S. and here in the lake states where we've got wolves, but we're trying to assess, at least we have this deer density map of the whole entire northern U.S. region. But wolves could be another indicator. There's a correlation between deer density. The work out there in Yellowstone quite a few years ago.
That's a very interesting research question. But we have not examined it. But certainly one would think could impact whatever impacts deer dynamics would in turn potentially affect forest dynamics. So that makes logical sense.
Right. There could be some positive things about wolves too.
Yeah.
We have some online questions.
Yes.
One or two online.
Okay. Can you expand on how deer density are responsible for Lyme, other forces such as small mammals, mice are a factor in the disease, and are you attributing deer alone to Lyme cases?
No. The short answer is no. It's just one part of the life cycle. Certainly the small mammals, much smaller mammals, are perhaps even more key to bloodborne diseases than deer.
But to follow up that a little bit, there have been some residential studies linking, high deer density resident communities with high tick populations, and then if they reduced, which you have the sort of Lyme disease numbers after that. They reduced the deer densities, that leads to fewer cases of reported Lyme disease cases. So that was sort of our thought in terms of looking at the Lyme disease data set to figure out where it's high, and there's some correlation there, but we didn't mean to sort of suggest that Lyme disease is an indicator of
just like the dynamics of forests, which are complex, many factors, the Lyme disease cycles the same way, and certainly deer are just a component of it, but can serve potentially as an indicator, but not. I wouldn't expect it to be a strong indicator.
Okay. Related to that, one more online question before we go back here. Do you have plans to overlay the new FIA deer impact data sets with the Lyme disease and deer vehicle collision data sets?
Yeah, we do. I think we've got, well, another 2 years, I think we'll have the full suite of this new deer density information from FIA, from low impact to high impact. The trouble with merging together all these different data sets are just the different scales that they're collected at. And so when we talk about deer density maps, we're really talking about the wildlife management unit level. I know the Minnesota Office of Public Safety has their deer collision map, but that's at the county level. And the Lyme disease information is also at the county level. So when we talk about using the FIA data with a lot of these other data sets, it's really about trying to make the data speak to one another and trying to really align them so that you can have a really good data set to sort of work with and really relate back to the vegetation, which is of our interest to sort of understand these forest health impacts.
Yeah, the problem is that these various data sources were not designed or collected to be used together. So there has to be a fair amount of creativity and statistical rigor to bring these together. So.
Yeah, a couple of questions. One is, you mentioned in terms of drivers of forest generation, stand density, stand structure, deadwood. What was the fourth one?
Recent results.
Yeah, they're up there.
What was the fourth
one?
Page 3?
Yeah. Above ground biomass was another one we had looked at.
Oh, yeah, wait, sorry. Wait, I really passed it. It's yours.
Yeah, the table.
Yeah. You find it. Nice.
I'm sorry.
This one there?
So, no, I'm not sure that was it.
Maybe the bigger table too.
Right. Drivers of forest regeneration.
Oh, very at the front, the introduction. Yeah, those are just a sampling of them. But there you go.
There you go. That's it. So management, understory vegetation. Could you say a little more about that? I'd like to hear some more elaboration on this slide. On what do these things mean exactly? Vis-a-vis regeneration in response to deer browsing pressure?
Well, no, this is not response to deer. This is just the basics of forest regeneration. Certainly, if you have management actions that alter the overstory, alter the species composition, alter the soil substrate, you're going to affect regeneration. So, and likewise, subsequent regrowth, your competition from understory, the successional status of the stand itself, as far as what kind of silvicultural system you're using, is going to affect tree regeneration. So this was just a broader statement on that.
Okay,
there's
generic.
Yes, generic.
No,
not really. Not really. But the one thing I do find interesting is, and I think could stand some more research, really, is that concept of deadwood and the mulching effect and deer protection for tree regeneration, because supposedly deer don't want to get, it's more of a hassle to browse through deadwood. So, and likewise, just when you mulch a tree in urban areas to help it regenerate or grow, that can have an effect. So, but we looked at deadwood and it was in there, but not a substantial factor. But we're collecting a higher intensity, sample intensity of deadwood measurements also. So in the years ahead, we should have more statistical power to look at that also.
So as all our ash dies, there's 7.25% of our forests ash, going to have a lot more deadwood.
Yes, that is true.
Could have an adverse effect on deer browsing and those particular areas.
One could have a hypothesis that would help regeneration. The key would be if there's a seed source for something other than ash in those areas. Yeah, it's a big issue for black ash forest.
Yes. Yeah, especially black ash and wetter sites. It's a huge issue. Okay, that's interesting.
I have, I only own 10 acres of forest in Minnesota, and it's all black ash and heavy deer browse, so I actually have no idea how I'm going to recover from 100% mortality with the deer browse pressure.
Because they like ash.
Yep. Yeah. Well, ash are going to be extinct probably eventually.
Well, not extinct.
No.
Much lesser.
Yeah, much less. Any other?
We have some more online questions.
Sure.
Can you comment further on the relationship between deer and invasive species and what is driving that relationship?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. That sort of goes back to the, this idea of, deer not just directly influencing vegetation, but sort of these indirect effects that they have. So think about garlic mustard, a pretty common invasive plant that we have really here in the southern and central part of the state. So the idea is that deer don't eat garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is an invasive plant, not really a browse-sensitive plant for deer. However, when deer go in and browse the other things that are around the garlic mustard, what they're doing is they're disturbing the soil, and garlic mustard is such a seeder that it's sort of leading into spreading the seed for garlic mustard, so garlic mustard can spread. And there have been studies that actually have shown sort of the spread of garlic mustard in sort of these high population deer density areas. So that's sort of one example of sort of looking at the effects of deer on invasive plant populations, and not just the presence, whether or not invasives are there or not, but also sort of their abundance, how common they are. And you look at things like, what we're looking at with our data set are things like the cover in a certain plot of invasive plants compared to what we think of as native species.
Another question we have from online. Let's see here. How do you account for seasonal changes, yarding in population densities?
Seasonal changes and measuring seedlings, do you think?
No, he's talking about deer yarding over the winter, right? So those are fine scale wildlife dynamics that certainly at a small scale would be massively important, right? So yarding in the winter and depending on the winter. So that we can't get at right now. Perhaps though, I have examined snow depth in relation to seedlings before. So on our plot network measures snow depth at the time of year they visit. So there's statistical issues with using that information, but NOAA collects, they have readily available raster data sets on snow depth through a season. So that type of information could be combined with inventory in the future to examine that kind of dynamic, but we have not explicitly looked at that. That's an interesting complexity.
And to follow on top of that, most of the FI measurements are measured in the summer. So we're really getting, look at things like understory vegetation. Well, most of that goes away in the early fall, right? So we're really measuring these forest attributes really at their peak. When they're green, when they're fully leafed out, where we might be able to see some of these impacts.
Still have some more questions online. If you want to keep going. All right. Someone's wondering where they can obtain the methods used for the deer density studies. Which agency should they contact?
Yeah, well, we'd be happy to share the QDNA map. That's sort of at least what we have for the Eastern U.S. Data set. We'd be happy to share that. For Minnesota specifically, the Minnesota DNR, and we've got the link that we can share maybe in the follow-up email that'll go out to everyone that's viewed the webinar. They've got sort of the annual mapped estimates of deer density and a lot of those other neat measurements, things like the winter severity index, that's related to deer populations as well. So yeah, we can get out the information to get those links.
Okay. Which species besides ironwood can regenerate and thrive at 21 deer per square mile?
That's a good one. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's, I mean, sooner or later, I mean,
If they're hungry enough, they'll eat everything, right? So, yeah, they'll eat everything. So there's no good answer for that. I mean, that comes down to forest management and protection when browse is that intense, and which doesn't make forest management operations cheaper, right? So no good answer. The answer is try to, unfortunately, on the other side of the equation, you want to try to keep your densities low enough so you don't face that situation.
Did you consider historic deer density that influenced recent seedling successes and failures due to impact on vegetation and potential seed beds?
Yeah, we haven't, the map we're using, the QDMA map, is I think it's 2009, so it's a recent map. And, you know, we can't really get deer density estimates much earlier than that, so a lot of the DNR agencies, maybe as, you know, as hunting increased, you know, in the 60s into the 1970s, that's really when it seems like we've been coming on line with a lot of sort of mapped estimates of deer density across state scales. So, we're a little bit unsure about, you know, the quality of the data, you know, if we go back any earlier than that, other than looking at sort of historic home ranges of elk versus deer versus moose and some other things. So.
I think what will be useful is, because that question brings up the question of change in time. So unfortunately, we can't go back in time with this new survey of browse, but what will be important will be to keep that monitoring program going so we get remeasurement and have an estimates of change so we can see how browse pressure changes and what effects that can have on forest dynamics such as growth, regeneration, understory, biodiversity, etc.
We have one last question from online. How does this data correlate with earthworm invasion studies?
Yeah, we haven't yet. There's the other, Dr. Lee Farrell here in Forest Resources Department to better answer that questions. But yeah, we haven't looked at the earthworm impacts related to what we're seeing with deer and vegetation dynamics. But in part, I mean, the good thing about the FIA data is it's across the nation. So you know, if we had an earthworm monitoring network, you know, we might be able to sort of correlate that data with sort of overlay it on top of the various data sets that we're using. But yeah, today we haven't looked at the earthworm impacts on top of the deer and vegetation impacts as well.
So this work is, as we mentioned at the start of the hour, preliminary. That's what makes it exciting because we know we can just see from initial results it's very important. And that with the new data sets coming in and all the ones that people have already mentioned to us, I think it's a really new, big avenue of research with real impact for forest management. So we're looking forward to moving it ahead in future years.
One last thing. Do you have a citation for that Albertson study that you mentioned? Is that up there? Or?
I do. I don't know if I've got the full citation, but I can follow up.
I'll talk to you about that.
And we can include it in the email as well.
Okay.
We still have questions coming in. You guys up for it?
Sure.
Easy ones.
Any research on browse differences in natural regeneration versus nursery conifers and seedlings?
Yeah, not that I've seen. I've done some studies and talked with some people at Cloquet. I think that's a great question. So the idea being, you know, well, maybe this sort of, what we're seeing sort of naturally regenerating in the woods may be less palatable than, you know, something grown as nursery stock and planted. You might think of, well, maybe he's had some fertilizer, you know, some additional nutrient amendments to it, so maybe those needles taste a little bit better than just what's grown out in the woods. So I think that's a great research question, particularly as, you know, particularly with our pine resource in Minnesota, one that we can maybe address with another research project.
Did you look at genetic variation and species regeneration and also natural versus planted regeneration? Again, I think that's close to what you just answered, right?
Yeah.
We have the potential to coarsely separate out stands that did have a artificial versus planted in our plot network. But it'd be a very coarse binary of like a situation of a planted versus a natural regeneration, subcultural treatment. So we had the potential to, like I said, do that in the future in a very broad manner. All right, talk to you.
And then The last question we have right now is, should we try to manage our deer herd closer to 4 deer per square kilometer or 8 deer per square kilometer?
Yeah.
I can't make an official federal statement.
That's right.
Time.
Well, it's 1 o'clock and it's a question for the DNR folks in wildlife, so, which they probably get many times every day. So.
Okay. I think that's it for online, so do we have any other questions here?
Great. Well, with that, we can sign off here. I know Emily mentioned earlier our webinar series for the next year in January, still under development, so keep tuned to the My Minnesota Woods website and the SFEC website for our webinar coming up in January. So